Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Tattoos with Intention podcast. Thanks for joining. I'm Taylor, part of the Tattoo Pathway team, and I'll be your host for today's episode. Before we get into today's conversation, if you do find anything we discuss useful or you enjoy listening, please subscribe or share the episode across your social network to get the conversation out there. The Tattoos with Intention podcast has been scheduled for once a month as part of our efforts to share zero-cost information that is focused on giving you insight and tools to create more meaningful and substantial tattoo experiences. In today's episode, I continued my conversation with cultural tattoo practitioner Lane Wilcken. If you haven't already given it a listen, we released part 1 of our chat last month, which I highly recommend tuning into. Lane is a scholar, cultural tattoo practitioner, and advocate for the critically endangered cultural practice commonly known as Batok, or the cultural tattoos of the Philippines. In today's episode, Lane discusses the profound spiritual and cultural significance of traditional tattooing. We explore questions of worthiness, both for those receiving and giving tattoos, really emphasizing the importance of emotional, mental, and spiritual readiness. Lane makes a distinction between tattoo artists and practitioners, giving us insight into the integrity, humility, and intensive process required for someone to become a practitioner. We talk about avoiding cultural appropriation and doing the work to connect to one's own ancestry to find deeper meaning in tattooing, rather than imitation and mimicry. We talk about Lane's school, Kata'o living traditions, which aims to preserve, sustain, and recover the indigenous knowledge, systems, and practices of the Philippines. We finish our chat with thoughts on the potential for mainstream tattoo culture to shift towards more meaningful and sacred tattoo practices. I just want to thank Lane for sharing his guidance and wisdom with us, and also thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. I just wanted to touch on being worthy of the designs that you're wearing. And to me, that really reinstills the significance and integrity and embodiment into tattooing. Am I worthy of the designs that I'm wearing? I just wonder what sort of transformation would happen in people's tattoo experiences if they asked themselves and sat with that before being tattooed. And I was also thinking about it in reverse of being someone who gives tattoos, on whether that question could be asked as well. Am I worthy to give these tattoos? I'd really love to hear your views on those.
Well, we could talk a little bit about feeling worthy to be able to facilitate marking another person. I'm participating in a book project done by one of my students where he's creating a directory of all the traditional or semi-traditional practitioners of our tattooing in the Philippines into kind of like a directory or a book of sorts that gives people an idea of the different practitioners that are out there and what they're about and a little bit of their history and story. And one of the questions that he asked me was about my journey and what advice I have to prospective practitioners or tattooists. The way I responded to that was, if you are deciding or considering, I would say, going down the practitioner path, which is different than a tattoo artist. You know, a tattoo artist has so much freedom, I would say. They're not under restrictive protocols per se, other than health and hopefully being a decent human being bestows tattoos. But for practitioners, there is that question of whether or not it's right for you. And for us in the Philippines, as well as many parts of the Pacific, this isn't something that you just take up because you feel like, I feel like I want to do tattoos. This is kind of a calling. It's considered calling. You might study, you might be a tattoo aficionado or whatever, but that doesn't necessarily mean you are chosen for this. You might have a lot of passion for tattooing, but that doesn't necessarily mean you are chosen for this. In our belief system, especially anciently, it's the ancestors that choose the practitioner. In the words of my teacher, Appropriation, says the tools will choose you whether or not you're meant to do this or not. That's a very humbling thing. So one of the brother is Kamali'i Hano Hano. He's Hawaiian. And one of my own apprentices struck up a conversation with him one day and asked Kamali'i, so tell me a little bit about your journey. And Kamali'i said, I've been stretching for X amount of years for Kumu, our teacher. I've learned to tap. I've learned the designs, etc. But if Kione told me tomorrow that my journey is over, and you have to keep in mind, Kamali'i we're probably a week or so away from his graduation, where he is given full permission to practice outside of the supervision of our teacher. But he told my student Nicanor that if Kione told him tomorrow that his journey was over, that he would have to have the humility to accept that it was not for him, that he was not chosen, and he would gracefully step away. The tattoo industry being so full of ego and self-centeredness, I would say selfishness, we're all putting it into basic terms. There's a lot of selfishness. It's very self-oriented. That's the way the tattoo industry culture has developed over the years. It's very self-oriented. And for Kamali'i to say, yeah, I have the humility to step down if my teacher tells me I'm done. That's very hard. Can you imagine putting years into a practice, devoting years of your life to learning, and then to be told, no, it's not for you? There is a winnowing process through all of this. I have a lot of people that will ask me to become my student or my apprentice. Now, I do have some students for cultural aspects outside of Tattoo, but actual apprentices for learning to do Batok, that's different. And at any step of the game, we're trying to figure out whether or not it's right for you. Usually within the first year or two, we figure that out. A lot of the time, people winnow themselves. They take themselves out of the equation because, one, it's not like doing a machine. It's not like using a machine. Just stretching the skin is very physically intensive. We're sitting on mats. We're holding these static positions. It's like planking for hours at a time. You have to have a strong core to do this type of tattooing, for one, if you're going to do it in a traditional way. So I've had people get very excited about doing the work, down for the culture, very excited, enthusiastic. They come in, they stretch one time, and I never see them again because they don't real. It's just work. People, they get on social media, they see me traveling to different places, they see the happy faces, the excitement that people have, and they're drawn towards it, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're chosen for this. It's really easy to make a commitment when you're excited about something. It's really hard to your commitment once you have to go to work. And so that in and of itself will eliminate people. But you have mental health issues, I don't think you should be touching other people's skin. From a spiritual aspect, from an energetic standpoint, in the words of one of my tattoo brothers, he describes it as, and many of the Suluwapes feel the same way, that we are putting prayers into people's skin. And if you're not in a good place, you shouldn't be touching another person's body. You're putting that into them. And so some of my students, I'll tell them, if they're going through a rough patch of some sort, some time out, you don't need to come in, take some time out, sort your life out, then come back when you're healthy. And for me as a practitioner, I have to be on top of that myself all the time. Every time I tattoo, I need to be in a good space. I need to be emotionally stable and strong. Sometimes in the process of doing Batoks, again, this is not a transactional thing in the way that Western or the tattoo industry is. This is a ritual space. We're doing prayers. We're doing offerings to the old ones. In some cases, we even place curses upon people, upon the designs not to harm the person that's wearing them, but to afflict those that would harm them. We especially do that. So if you see one of our women with markings, particularly chest markings, that means she carries a curse, and you better not mess with her. A lot of women,
Well,
I told them beforehand, I think this is one of the aspects of getting that color piece, is that we will place a curse upon you for those that would harm you. And you have to be okay with that. And some women, they're not. They're not comfortable carrying that kind of responsibility. Other women, they'd say, Lane, curse me up. So how can I facilitate that if I'm not in the right space? If I'm angry, I might want to put that on a person. It might not be the right thing to do. So even once you become a practitioner, you still have to keep yourself in a very good place. Address your mental health issues as they come by, your emotional problems, anything like that has to be addressed before we do ritual, because we don't want to put that into people's bodies. So that goes a little bit into our belief system around tattooing. Now, if you don't believe that and you just want to mark people, be a tattoo artist. But if you want to do ritual work, you have to live a different lifestyle. For example, one of the taboos that we have before we tattoo, the day before we tattoo, we're not allowed to drink. The practitioner, the stretchers are not allowed to drink, and obviously the recipient is not allowed to drink. So for many years, I didn't have any alcohol because I was tattooing all the time. If that's part of your lifestyle and you'd like to have some fun, we can't do that if we're going to be working. Not that it's taboo out of our lives. It's just in the day before and the day of our work, we cannot be intoxicated. I'm sure nobody wants to get tattooed by a drunk person. So that's just one little taboo that we have to follow in regards to keeping ourselves as pure as possible when we do this work. We do offerings and prayers even before the recipients arrive, cleansing of the area, making sure that all the respective deities are appeased before we can start. And then we appease the ancestors of that individual that come to it, and they are invited to come into the space. So it's a lot more involved. If you're not in a good way in our belief system, you're not going to be able to summon them, for one. And then the tattoo is just vanity. It's just a mark. It's just a decoration, because it is the old ones that bestow. Like I said, the tattoo itself is not magic. It is the relationship that you have with those on the other side. So me as a practitioner, I help facilitate that relationship and honor it and strengthen it through what I do as a tattooist or a mambabato. So yeah, there's a question of worthiness. And if at any point along the way with my students, if they don't feel like they're up for this, they can step out, and there's no shame in that. In fact, I respect that, because it shows emotional maturity. It shows mental maturity and spiritual maturity to be able to say, this isn't for me. And it's not for everyone. If it was, then practitioners would be a dime a dozen. And unfortunately, because of things like tattoo shows, I don't know if I'm able to name any, but reality TV shows about tattooing has glamorized the industry. So anybody who has a subscription to Amazon or whatever can buy a tattoo machine online and get some ink and then tattoo another person. But picking up our tools is different. One, you can't buy them at the store. You have to make them by hand. So with my students, not only do they have to be spiritually, I won't say pure, but mature. You all have to make adjustments as we go down the road. But also, each of my students has spiritual gifts. They have a connection with the other side. If I'm okay pulling something from Harry Potter, I don't train muggles. I don't train people without ability. How can you facilitate something that's spiritual if you do not have that type of ability or connection? That's one of the prerequisites before even consideration bringing somebody into our school, is that they have to be spiritually gifted. Then there's the aspect, you have to be a craftsperson. You have to be able to shape wood. You have to be able to shape bone. You have to learn how to do binding. Each of those materials is chosen, particularly the wood and the bone is chosen for their spiritual qualities, as well as their utilitarian aspects. How much does the wood flex? How strong is the material that we're using? Just doing the binding is a prayer in and of itself, because the patterns that we put into the binding on our tools are types of what we call in my mother's language, anib. They are protective devices. And so they learn that and have to do that well. And then there's also all the lore that they have to learn. So you have to be smart. You can't be real basic when it comes to this. There's a ton of knowledge you have to be able to digest and process and be able to recall and use. Some of our designs are mnemonic devices to remember our oral history. You need to know all of that as well. Know the stories that are attached to the different designs, or the cosmological aspects of the different designs and how they fit together. I compare our tattooing in the Pacific as a type of visual language or visual vocabulary. So composition is important because it's like creating a sentence with adjacent designs, or a paragraph or a conceptual idea. And then some of that is formulaic as well too. Things that I can't really share the masses. There are levels of knowledge that there's one level for the public, one level for the recipient, and then a level of knowledge that's reserved for the practitioners. And so people will, to go on a little quick tangent here, Taylor, people will accuse me of gatekeeping knowledge. And that is the responsibility of a practitioner, is that we do gatekeep knowledge. We keep that knowledge sacred. It is not considered secret, but it's sacred. And so it's only allowed to be shared in certain circumstances, usually within ritual. Like I mentioned in our previous conversation, a lot of these designs can be linked to specific spirits and deities and their representation. Like, for example, if it's the moon deity, we cannot speak about her unless she is present in the sky. That is her manifestation of that particular spirit, is the physical moon in the sky. So we would not even talk about specific deities without some representation or having them invited into the space. So all this information the students have to learn also. And then the skill set to tattoo and the nuances of that. So there's a ton of information that comes into becoming a practitioner. Natalia, who was going to be on the call with us originally, she was with me for almost 8 years before I turned her loose and gave her permission to practice. Other tattoo shops, it's short in comparison. I know that there are some old school tattooists there where it's 5 years to apprentice. But for us, it's whenever the student is ready. So some learn faster, some learn slower, and that's okay. My responsibility as a teacher is to make sure that I put good people out there into the world to serve the community. So there's a lot of responsibility and a lack of freedom that for tattoo artists is very hard to make the transition over. It's also very hard to go from, this is my artistic expression, into often very strict protocols and ways of doing things. I remember a few years into the practice, I started getting burned out. And I had to step away for a while because I recognized that I was starting to feel like I was just going through the motions, and I can't be like that. I have to check myself constantly so that my ego doesn't insert itself into the practice and I'm healthy in doing my practice. So a lot of different things there. Now for the recipients, we have protocols that they have to follow before they come. There are some that are practical to make sure that they're the healthiest they can be. If your skin's healthy, then the tattoo is going to go good. Any tattoo artist that is worth their salt knows this. So we have some physical protocols that they need to follow, like avoiding things that are anti-inflammatories. They can't take ibuprofen. They can't take painkillers beforehand. They need to avoid caffeine. I don't want them bleeding all over me. Just things like that, the practical aspects. And then there's preparation spiritually as well for our recipients. If they have problems in their home, if they have problems with their family, they're encouraged to resolve those before they come here. One of the reasons for that is because these designs represent family. If you're at odds with your family, then how can we give you markings for your family? That has to be resolved beforehand. Make sense? Sometimes those things actually don't come out until we do the ritual. People might have things kind of locked away in old memories. And so one of the other aspects of doing our practice is that it is considered in both a physical way, an emotional, and a spiritual way, a healing ritual. It heals the rift between us and our loved ones who have passed on, binds us together, again, like the signature on a covenant or a contractual agreement that you will pay more attention to them and they will pay more attention to you. That relationship is enhanced by receiving Batok. We also have to have people, I encourage people to pray. Whatever their spiritual background, and we have people from all walks of life come to our space to receive work. And if they prepare themselves spiritually, get in touch with the divine, try and facilitate the relationship with those old ones before they even come. That way the experience is more powerful. We like to think of what we do as practitioners as empowering our people. It's not just adornment, empowerment in a way. In the Pacific, we call the spiritual authoritative power that can be passed from person to person or ultimately from the divine to the ancestors to the living descendants. We call that manna. And in the Philippines, we used to have a very strong concept of manna like they do among Polynesians. But because we were colonized 2 centuries earlier, a lot of that still has become fragmented. There are still some ethnic groups that use manna in its original form as the authoritative spiritual power that can be inherited, passed on, or even lost through misuse. So the manna of the practitioner is very important. That's what we pass into people's skin, into our recipients, is our own manna. So we are not strong. The recipient can't receive that from us. Manna can be lost through inappropriate or malicious deeds, certain associations. I was at a symposium not too long ago, and they were doing what I would call team building exercises that were also quasi-ritualistic. And I hung back from that. I didn't participate. And a Ojibwe woman asked me why I was not participating. And I said, I cannot. How did I put it? I told her I cannot. It sounds really arrogant and pretentious, but I said I can't sully my energy with everybody else. I have to keep myself, because I don't know those people. I don't know what kind of hangups they have, and I can't take that upon myself if I'm going to be doing the work. So I have to keep myself aloof from all of that. The mana can be polluted, if you will. And so we have to be conscientious of that as practitioners as well. It's a little bit stricter lifestyle, again, than a tattoo artist. So it isn't for everybody. It isn't for everybody.
There's so many layers that you've touched on in highlighting what it is to be worthy to give the design. And some of the things that stood out to me, which differentiates from an artist, it's not about just being technically proficient. It's not about just doing good art. It's these layers of the emotional, mental, spiritual within self, but also how you're holding that space for others. And it's actually a lifestyle. It's a way of living, not, I guess, a career as such. From what you're sharing, it feels a lot more integrated. And, I don't give tattoos. I'm on the receiving end, and my work with Tattoo Pathway focuses on the research side of things. I'm a bit of a data nerd and very passionate about people connecting to transformational aspects of tattooing, but also just hearing what you're sharing on the receiving end of being tattooed. It's also not just about showing up to an appointment that you've booked in and you've had a big night last night or you're going in for a bit of fun. There's also these protocols, again, on the level of the physical change you're going to be going through and the physical health, but also emotional, mental, and spiritual. And yeah, I just think that's a really different way of approaching tattooing than how it currently is in the tattoo industry. And it really bolsters that being worthy element. And also, I think it touched on the responsibility, just sharing all the different elements that you have to consider. That takes huge responsibility and humility. Like you said, there's these values embedded in the approach towards tattooing. You mentioned gatekeeping, and I wrote down a little note saying there was more barriers to entry. That can have a negative connotation in some contexts, but the way that I see it and the way that you shared it is it's actually separating the everyday from the sacred. And that's really important in tattooing and especially within the context that you're tattooing in. And I don't know, I think like maybe we could do with some more of that in tattooing in the mainstream industry. Could there be some more protocol and guidance and barriers to entry? I don't necessarily see that as explicitly a bad thing if that was to move across into the mainstream tattoo culture as well. I guess it would just come down to who's making those decisions, why are those decisions being made? And I can imagine that going in lots of different directions. I'd be curious to understand when you talk about you deserve to be more than an imitation, what you mean by that. What does that mean when you tell people that?
In a very consumer-driven culture, capitalistic consumer-driven culture, people just assume that if I have money, I can have that. If I want that, I can have it. And that can be just even the way in the tattoo industry where people walk into a shop and they see flash, right? And well, I like that. I want it. Here's my money. Let's go. So you really do have an imitation of sorts going on there. Or here's the one that I saw when I first began doing all of this is I would get young men usually. They'd been to the gym, they bulked up, they got muscular, and they saw The Rock's tattoos, Dwayne Johnson's tattoos. And I'm like, I'm ready for my warrior tattoo. And I'm like, really? And sometimes I'll entertain it just for a small moment. And so where's this place supposed to be? Well, I want on one side of my chest, over my shoulder, and down my arm. Oh, like The Rock's. And they're like, yeah, but Filipino style. And I'm like, we need to have a bigger conversation. That's imitation. Actually, from a cultural standpoint, that's trying to take mana that isn't yours. And you deserve to be more than an imitation of The Rock. Have your own connection with your own ancestors. You deserve to have your own people's designs. Even if you took something like The Rock's tattoo, and I've seen people that sell transfer stencils for it. It's crazy. But don't be a fanboy. Don't be a fangirl of somebody else's work. Discover yourself. This is just me speaking philosophically, but I think one of the greatest things that you can discover in this life is who you really are. Outside of your ego, outside of all the constructs that humanity places on you to live in these societies, discover who you really are as a person, because you're unique and you deserve to be honored in that way. Now, there are designs. For example, if you're Ilocano from the Philippines, a particular ethnic group that I belong to, if you're Ilocano, you should have Ilocano designs. One of my students a long time ago asked, how do you keep from repeating designs or compositions? And every person that I work on, the composition is slightly different. but the motifs are the same. And so he says, eventually you're going to end up in repeat, aren't you? So you have to understand again, this is inclusive practice, not exclusive. In Western tattooing or modern tattooing industry, you really want to be unique sometimes. This is my art. People who get something outside of Flash, they want something custom designed. They give it to an artist. They put your own spin on this, etc. But with us, if you are Ilocano and you get a creation story motif, you're going to get something that looks very similar to another person's. It might even be identical, but that's to unify us as a culture. I put one of my taglines when I do social media is, you deserve to be more than an imitation. That also doesn't mean that you're not part of a group, that you're completely separate from your ethnic group. So you're going to get motifs that your ethnic group has. In that way, you are part of a group, but also you're going to be honored in your unique for what you do in the community, your own experience, what you might need strength with, what you might have a weakness that we can bolster with. So there's going to be elements that show that you're part of the community, but there's also going to be elements that are specifically for you as an individual. So yeah, you deserve to be more than just a copy of somebody else's design. That may not be for you. That placement may not be for you. Again, these designs, when they're put on a specific part of the body, they interact with acupuncture points, meridian lines, etc. So even if I have the exact same symbol and I put it on a different part of the body, or let's say somebody copies something off of my webpage or my social media, and they say, oh, I really like that placement. That placement's cool, or that looks sexy, or whatever, and they copy it. They may not understand that I might have placed that particular design there to help bolster fertility, for example. You may not need extra fertility. You may not have a problem with your fertility. So why would you're ignorant? You put something on you that you may or may not need. Running with the fertility aspect, there are infertility points as well. And if you're not literate, you could end up doing something harmful to your own body. So, don't ignorantly go out there and copy somebody else's design exactly the way it is, because you don't know what has gone into that composition. You may not know what ethnic group that belongs to. In the Philippines, we are considered kind of like sister cultures. We're siblings within our archipelago. All our different ethnic groups are closely related, but they are distinct. The languages are distinct. If I speak Ilocano, a Tagalog person from Manila wouldn't be able to understand me, and vice versa. So even though we're very closely related, we're distinct. So sometimes people get lost in that too, that, oh, this is from the Philippines, I'm Filipino, I can have this. No, because there are over 130 some odd languages in the Philippines, ethnic groups go along with those. And you might have a very similar or identical design from one ethnic group to the other, but it's the size, the placement on the body, the orientation of that motif that delineates what ethnic group it belongs to. And if you don't know the difference, you're marking yourself to the wrong ancestry. It really behooves you to go to an experienced, knowledgeable practitioner, whatever your ethnic background, whether you're from the Philippines or Europe or whatever, to go to somebody that is literate in your people's designs, that can make those compositions in a way that isn't an imitation, but does unite you to your family and to your community. I hope that answers your question.
Oh, it really does. And I'm so glad you touched on that, going to a qualified practitioner as well. I think that's really great guidance for people who are being tattooed, is also having discernment in who is tattooing you and formulating a relationship that can guide you towards getting tattoos that are more in alignment and true of who you are. And some of the language that I've used just personally and in the tattoo pathway around this concept is tattoos that are revealing versus tattoos that are concealing. And this idea that concealing tattoos are the ones that we get when, there's imitation and mimicry and we're trying to be someone. And I've definitely had my fair share of those. The first 10 years that I was getting tattooed, and I started quite young, I was really trying to build this image and they weren't reflective of who I was. And then on the converse, this idea of tattoos that are revealing, there's more depth and work to them, but it's showing who you are. And so it's free of that imitation and free of that copying and free of that entitlement, because it has to come from your life, your lived experience, outside of the ego, outside of the constructs. I do think we, as someone who receives tattoos, having a practitioner that can give guidance has really helped me. From my personal experience, I've found that really important part of the equation, so to speak. When we first started talking and you were sharing about your journey into tattooing in Hawaii, and you were feeling this resonance with what you were seeing and hearing, but didn't want to appropriate. And I think there's a lot of people who are in Western culture and perhaps even in the mainstream tattoo industry who are looking for more in their tattoos than what have been prescribed. And they do look to other cultures for guidance and advice. But even with me reading your book, right, it's been so insightful and I've learned so much about the tattooing context in the Philippines. But it would never be appropriate then for me to walk away and say, I'm going to go get those designs and I'm going to use that framework for placement, that appropriation piece. What it has done is that really inspired me and called me to look into my own context. I guess my question here is for people who are receiving or giving tattoos who might not be satisfied with how the current tattoo industry is or their current approach is, what guidance would you give to them to find that meaning without moving into the space of appropriation?
One of my friends, Julia Magiao, she's a Melanesian PNG woman who's a practitioner. We see this a lot in the practitioner circle, I would say. We notice when people will post things, tattoo artists will say, oh, this is Kalinga inspired, this is Maori inspired, or whatever. Inspired by often is just appropriation, but I've changed my homework a little bit so it doesn't look like I've copied. If you really would like to do the deeper dive, it's going to take work. And for some of us more than others, for those who have living tattoo practices, that work is right there. You have a great privilege there, an opportunity to receive something that is part of a continuous tradition. But for those of us that are a little more remote from or distanced from our ancestral ways or indigenous ways, you have to do some research. You have to do the work. But it's worth it. It's totally worth it to really discover who your people are, how they thought, what they believed, what they knew. Their wisdom is locked in the tattoos. So if you take the time to explore that, for example, my brother-in-law, he's primarily of Scandinavian and Scottish and Irish descent. And he asked me if he could get Polynesian tattoos. And I said, no, that wouldn't be appropriate. But let's take a look at your own ancestry and see what they have. Of course, he didn't want to do that, but I wanted to do it. I was curious. And me being part Scandinavian as well, I was curious. I did a little bit of a deep dive into that. Originally it was for him, but then it was for me. And I get to see some things from my Nordic ancestry that were really beautiful. There's still, the debate's still out there whether or not Scandinavians tattooed or not. There's only a couple of accounts of it, but kind of appears that they did so. Now, did they hand tap it like you see on, I don't even call it documentaries, but the shows that depict Vikings getting tattooed, they did not hand tap. If they did anything, it was probably hand poked. But when you start looking into the artwork of Scandinavia, the scrolling types of designs are very beautiful. There are also the runes that are very incredibly complex outside of the what I would call neo-pagan types of interpretations. The runic language or alphabet, if you want to call it that, is based off of Old Etruscan, which is where our Roman alphabet is based off of. And it can be read three different ways. It can be read conceptually, symbolically, or phonetically, similar to Chinese characters. Unfortunately, the West, we're illiterate in the two other ways of reading now. We only read it phonetically. And sometimes not even a good job of that. We consider words like light, right? We don't pronounce all those letters anymore. But you break it down conceptually or symbolically, there's stories in just the words. And so we know that there were types of runes that possibly were tattooed. That's just a little sample from one particular ethnic group in Europe. But you take a deep dive into your ancestry, really discover people's culture, you're going to be very handsomely rewarded. Very rewarding to discover all of that. So my encouragement to others is just take the time to get to know yourself, time to get to know the people you come from, and the journey will be definitely worth it.
Thank you. That's really good advice. And it's actually something I've started doing myself recently in light of listening to another podcast where they were talking about the same thing, the importance of the ancestral roots. I was like, wow, I actually don't know what that is for me. So slowly starting to find avenues to connect to that more. And like you say, there is an element of digging deep and doing the work. And I think that links back to the start of this conversation around the importance of taking time and, again, just to reiterate it, doing the work. I think that's really important.
In our school, we say patience is a virtue, especially when it comes to tattoos.
Yes. I actually use that saying patience is a virtue myself, and applying it to tattoos is so relevant. And I'm so glad you brought up your school because I did want to ask you a little bit about that. I've seen your website online and so have a bit of a high level understanding of the education and research component of your school. And forgive me if I'm pronouncing it wrong. Is it Kata'o Living Traditions?
Pretty close, Taylor. Well, it is Kata'o. Yeah.
I'd love to learn more about it because, like I've shared, at the Tattoo Pathway, we're at the beginning stages of our research and education. And I guess you could say we're really in a stage of paying attention, doing preliminary research, and having conversations like these. And so when I've seen your school and it makes me excited, I'm like, wow, just seeing what you're doing in that research and education space. If you don't mind sharing a little bit more about what your school does and also the impact that you're seeing that has on people and community participating in it.
Yeah. So my school is Kata'o Living Traditions. We have a threefold mission. One, to preserve the indigenous knowledge systems and practices of the Philippines, with an emphasis on tattooing, but not limited to tattooing, and to sustain those practices through active practice, sustain those traditions through practice, and then to recover those practices that have fallen into disuse or have been lost. And so that's the threefold mission of Kata'o Living Traditions: to preserve, sustain, and recover. Again, I pick my students. I don't have open enrollment.
Wow.
People ask me to join all the time, and for some people, I tell them no for any number of reasons, but I select the students. This was started originally with me, Christian Kabuai, and Ray Hagi-san. We were the founders of it. Christian and Ray practice baybayin or surat or sulat. It's a old writing system in the Philippines we had prior to the Roman alphabet. So they were recovering that, putting it into art. Christian is a visual artist. He does painting, etc. Ray does pyrography. And then here comes Lane, and into all these old symbols and stuff. So it was a good marriage. And now Christian is actually a tattoo practitioner as well. He's been given permission to practice. The three of us founded Kata'o Living Traditions. We've had students come and go over the years. And like I mentioned earlier, sometimes we ask them to leave. Sometimes they leave of their own accord. We try to get the right people to do the work. There are very few students compared to to university or something like that. We have less than 20 students altogether. Some of them are here with me in Las Vegas, Nevada, and others are remote. And we do some online stuff that way, or whenever they can come through to visit with me and to work with me, build tools together, that kind of a thing. It's really rewarding because when I first started practicing, there were some other tattoo artists, I would say, that were trying to hand tap, but I think it was more of for a lot of them, it was more of an exotification of culture, that brand they used as a brand. In the tattoo industry, you've either got to be mad talented or have a gimmick of some sorts. And so a lot of tattoo artists see this as a gimmick to pull away from the herd, to draw attention to themselves. Obviously, in the tattoo industry, the more famous you are, the more unique you are, or that can be through talent or your gimmick. The more you charge, the more money you make, right? So tattoo artists have a very hard time mentally making the jump to practitioner, to go from something that feels self into conformity within these restrictive guidelines and protocols that we have to follow. My teacher, Suluwape, he's like, don't even bother training tattoo artists. They can't do it. One, you have to switch from using your dominant hand to draw to your non-dominant hand. So when I'm tattooing, I'm not drawing with my dominant hand. I draw with the other hand, the feminine side. The reason for that is in our old belief system, males are not creators. Only women are. And so for us to create something, even designs on the skin, we use our feminine side. The masculine side holds mallet stick, you want to call it that. It's the energy to push the needles into the skin. But the two of them coming together, the receiving side, the dominant side, the two of them coming together creates, forgive me for being a little bit vulgar, it's sex on top of the skin. It's the coming together of masculinity and femininity. You make something beautiful.
Yeah, so, the creation.
Exactly. You have to unlearn all of that, and you might be a fantastic artist, painter, line art, whatever, but then you have to switch over to your feminine hand, and that really shakes things up. You have to start all over again. Forces you to be humble.
It does. That's a huge shift in and of itself.
I'm not sure if I answered the question, Taylor, or if I went on a...
You did answer the question, and I'm sitting with it because being in the early stages of education and research as well, and seeing how different things that we share land and other things don't land for people. Something I'm noticing, not just within tattooing, but perhaps more life in general, is I think there are some people that do want to do the work, and there are some people that don't want to do the work. And I'm not saying neither is good or bad. I just notice that difference. And so with the way that you run your school and choosing your students, is that also part of having a bit of a screening to ensure it's bringing in people that do want to do the work?
Some of my students approached me and asked if they could learn, and some have not. Those that ask to learn, I scrutinize even more because I want to know, why do you want? What's your motivation? For Filipino Americans, being separated from our homeland, living in a foreign country, a lot of the time we have an imposter syndrome. We're not Filipino enough. And sometimes I get recipients that way. They think that if I get a tattoo, if I get a traditional tattoo, I'm going to be more authentically Filipino. This isn't to address your imposter syndrome. Some people, if I'm a tattoo practitioner, this is going to make me feel special. This is going to address my sense of self-worth. This is going to help me be more authentically Filipino. You should not be tattooing for that reason. This isn't for your therapy. My school isn't for your therapy. Take care of all of that and then reassess and see where you're at, you know? For us, people talk the buzzword, decolonize this, decolonize that. It's been used so much, that word decolonization has been used so much that it doesn't even hold meaning for a lot of people anymore. It's just a buzzword. But I look at all the different factors that exterior cultures and society impose upon us. And that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what group you are. We all have things imposed upon us by the greater society. And for all of us, at some point in our people's history, we were colonized. We had foreign ideas and thoughts planted into our ideologies and cultural psyche. Divesting yourself of some of those things helps you understand, one, where you come from and who you are, but also helps you distill things down to a more core level. For Filipino Americans, that process of decolonizing, I compare decolonization to grieving, and there are stages of grief. First, there's denial. The Americans were great to us. They didn't murder a whole bunch of us. They didn't raise any of our cities. There's my mom's generation, for example, just loves Americans. That was because of the ideology that was imposed upon them. Here's the benevolent saviors that brought civilization to our culture. Same could be said of how a lot of Filipinos view Spaniards when they came to our islands and took over. Oh, they were so wonderful to us. And they don't talk about how they used to chop our hands off if we didn't make enough sales for them. Stuff like that. There's denial. Then people discover the atrocities, and then they become angry. And that's where a lot of people will, especially in the Philam community, get involved in social justice as a way to express that anger, realizing that things were taken away. Then it gets stuck in that angry place, you're never going to heal. After that anger, there's bargaining. And that's where people usually come to me for a tattoo. Bargaining as, if I get a tattoo, I'm going to be more connected to my roots. I'm going to be more Filipino. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. If I learn martial arts, if I learn the language better, if I learn to cook better, it's all these bargaining strategies to address the loss. But then there's oppression. Like for me, for example, growing up in the diaspora, I realized that I'm probably not going to speak like a native. I can speak, but not like a native. And just becoming accepting of the circumstances that happened, accepting that there was a loss. Yes, that the Americans took things away from us. Yes, the Spaniards took things away from us. But it is what it is right now. And instead of looking at the loss of what has been taken away, let's see what we still have. What do we still have that we can build upon? What can we grow from all of this? But for a lot of people in the world that are trying to rediscover their indigeneity or their cultural past, instead of looking at the loss and what has been taken away, look at what you have. Look at what you still retain. Look what your people still possess, and then build on top of all of it. Use that as your framework to rebuild or recover what you can. Even if you've been colonized by Romans, for example, a millennia ago, you still retain indigenous ways of doing things. You may not be indigenous anymore, but your ancestors were, and you can draw upon that. I hope that helps.
It really does. And I think there was some really powerful reframes you just shared towards the end there, moving into that place of empowerment to learn more and to see what's left. And it actually almost reminds me of the "you have been nipped" piece, where you said that was this process of moving from victimhood to empowerment, and just what being in that place opens up to you. And coming back to that, what are your motivations? That's a really great line of self-inquiry that people can take into, again, life and tattooing, grounded in honest reflection. And I think that offers growth when we can be really honest with ourselves. So what are my motivations? Kind of, again, if I use myself as an example, if I go back to some of my earlier tattoos, if I had the guidance to ask myself what are actually my motivations right now, I probably wouldn't have got them because they weren't that substantiated. A final question, and it's a bit open, but is there anything else you'd like to share with people who are seeking more meaningful tattoos?
For those of you that are seeking more meaningful tattoos, again, my encouragement is to look into your own culture. There are circumstances where it is the prerogative of the practitioner to gift designs from our culture to another person, but it is definitely, in my opinion, much more meaningful when you find something that is rooted to your own people, to your own ancestry. And that becomes really beautiful. If you put in the work, you're going to be rewarded, and it adds value. It really does. To have these protocols in place, what people will think of as restrictive aspects of traditional tattoo, it actually adds value. If it isn't something that you can just buy, right? So when you take the time, how much more meaningful are those markings in your skin going to be? How much more powerful are those markings going to be? For us, and one of the reasons I agreed to do your podcast, Taylor, with Tattoo Pathways, is that I see that you're trying to make that shift in the mainstream culture. I think ultimately that would be the greatest goal, is to make that meaningful shift in the tattoo industry so that people approach this from a place of sacredness or for spirituality. Again, we all come from cultural backgrounds, and most people in the world's tattooed at one point or another. And when you look at those cultures that have tattoos or had tattoos in the past, you'll realize that it wasn't just art. All of these cultures, the taboos put around their ritual tattoos, all of them have spiritual aspects tied to them, ancestors or deities attached to these designs. So don't get it for nationalistic pride, so to speak. If you're looking for something, or go to your ancestors, discover their taboos, discover the aspects that create those restrictions, those protocols, because in those restrictions is where you find the sacred. And treating this as a sacred event, as a ritual event, ceremonial, etc., it adds the value to what you have in your skin. Sometimes people are like, this is a famous tattoo artist. I want to get from someone famous, inadvertently trying to get some money from that person because of their fame. You could identify with a particular subculture when people were really into Harley Davidson motorcycles here in the States. Everyone's getting their logo tattooed on. So people I think on a subconscious level are seeking this tradition. They're seeking it, but they perhaps don't have the guidance of someone like, my teacher, or even, going onto your website and your project, Tattoo Pathways. People are looking, they just don't know that they're looking. And if we all do our part, when we have more people diving into their ancestral past and tattoos and body markings, that's going to help shift this culture in the tattoo industry. And I see people taking up hand poking, for example, adding ritual elements. Now, sometimes Tibetan singing bowls may not be part of your tradition to have in your ceremonies, but your people did have aspects and taboos and different traditions around their tattooing that are equally as beautiful and bring in a sense of reverence that comes along with these sacred markings. Again, my encouragement is don't give up. The more work that you put into it, the more that you do the research, the more satisfied you're going to be with what you receive, the more meaningful it will be. How powerful it is to have something from. I remember my first tattoo that I got, I was in my 30s when I got it. I'd been studying it for over a decade already. But when I finally got my first markings, and I'll show you, Taylor, since you can see me right now still, this was my first markings here. And it goes from my knee up to my hip. But I remember after receiving that, knowing that it was appropriate for my lineage. It's actually a very stylized canoe and represents the canoe that brought my ancestors to the islands. And the canoe has a name. We know the name of the canoe that brought my people over, my ancestors over. And to have that on my body after years of waiting, doing research, discovering what the design was, not just the design itself, but also the meanings of the design, the purpose of the design. It helped me understand where to put it on my body, how to put it on my body, what it means and what it does as a mnemonic device to remember the oral traditions of my people and also the way that they thought. And all of us, I think, should benefit from a little bit more guidance in our lives. And taking on the wisdom of the past helps us navigate all of that. So don't give up. And I hope that you, Taylor, don't give up, that you continue on your path with this. I think what you're doing is extremely worthwhile. And I haven't met you in person. I hope that we get to meet in person one day.
Oh, I would love that.
I would love to give you a big hug for what you're doing. I think it's very worthwhile.
Thank you, Lane. I'll extend the hug as well to our team, Mark and Drish. We really are a team. And yeah, I just want to acknowledge those really strong words you've ended this conversation with. I know I'm going to sit back and listen to this podcast and just have more layers sink in. And I really hope for the people who have tuned in and are listening that they also can sit with it, because there's so much guidance in what you've shared, bridging that gap between the lack of guidance. You shared a lot of guidance today. So I thank you so much for joining us. And it's just felt like such a privilege to talk to you on so many levels with your experience and your wisdom and your knowledge. And as someone who personally loves research and data, just seeing what went into your book and how well it was written, I think just like the personal part of me that I really respect your approach in that. So yeah, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah. Well, I know there's Filipinos in Australia, so I probably should make a trip down there sometime.
Oh, please do. And if you do, let us know for sure. Thanks everyone to those who listened in. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. There's a lot to take away from this to contemplate and guide you towards approaching tattoos in a more meaningful and substantial way. So big thank you again to Lane. We've provided links to Lane's social media and website in the show notes. And that's all for now. We'll see you next time.